again, and welcome to the Gospel of Mark. I'm Jim Grant, your host, and it's been a pleasure for the first 13 episodes of this series, breaking open chapter and verse of our favorite gospel. I say our favorite because I'm speaking of Father Mike Lastiri, who is the director of the Office of Worship and Evangelization for our Diocese of Fresno. And across from me is Dr. Robert Maldonado, who is a scripture professor at the University, California State University, Fresno, in the philosophy department. Father Mike is also the pastor of the parish of Immaculate Heart of Mary down in Hanford, and we're wishing that all the parishes are going to be enjoying, we hope, this course on the Gospel of Mark, and that you're using it for your enrichment. We are in the middle of that chapter, and I wonder if we could begin, but first let me say one idea about what we're going to deal with today. It's called a Markan sandwich, and that's a word I made up, but what it means is this. There are two stories that we're going to be dealing with, of which we start one, we jump into another, we close with the first. This is something Mark does powerfully, beautifully well at least 5 different times. This is actually the second time that we're looking at it. We saw it earlier in chapter 3. We'll see it again in 6. We'll see it in 11 and even in chapter 14. It's Mark's way of putting a context onto both readings so that they almost shed light, one forward, one backwards. I wonder if we could begin with the wonderful story of Jairus' daughter sandwiched around the powerful story of the woman with the hemorrhage. Please.
And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was bedside at the sea. They came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet. And he besought him, saying, My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live. And he went with them, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him.
And there was a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, If I touch even his garments, I shall be made well. And immediately the hemorrhage was ceased, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone forth from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, Who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, Who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had been done to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, and be healed of your disease.
While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But ignoring what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, Do not fear. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, they saw tumult, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, Why do you make a tumult and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, and took the child's father and mother, and those that were with him, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cumi, which means, Little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and walked. She was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat.
As I said, 2 very powerful stories that have been somehow blended by somebody, and right now we're thinking Mark has something to do with it, at least in this structure as we have it today. Robert, do you want to start with any initial insights into this second half of chapter 5?
Well, it's because of the sandwiching technique, it's kind of hard because, it's almost everything needs something from something else. But then I guess it's easy, too. You just jump in and start. But there are several things that are linking this together. One is that the woman has this flow of blood for 12 years. The girl is 12 years old, so you have that kind of 12-year motif. Obviously, 12 is a number that's kind of biblically significant with 12 tribes and various other allusions. It's also, this woman has had the flow of blood for 12 years, so she's been suffering with this condition, whatever it was, for a long time. Her resources have been depleted. We don't know her precise age, but presumably she's older than younger, and so you have a woman with a flow of blood toward the end or later in life, and then you also have a sort of a younger girl, but also kind of at the cusp of adulthood or becoming more adult, who is dead, and so there's sort of the restoration of life at the beginning of 12 and at the end of 12. That's kind of a nice connection between the two.
Father Mike, any initial thought as we begin, something that you think already is a good thing to lay on the table as we look at the two stories together, or focus on one of them?
Well, I think, again, one can't escape, again, some of the things mentioned by Robert, but also the sense of touch. I know we'll get into that more, but how there's an intimacy, if you will, with both the woman who touches the helm of the garment of Jesus, the girl who actually feels his physical touch. There is that linking, if you will, Jesus to the people that he was around. I think we can't, again, escape the reality that he's dealing with people that are outside of his group, if you will. One again wonders, is this more that he does for the believers who had become believers? Now he's dealing with the head of the synagogue, so he's dealing with power structure in a sense, but that within the particular religious body. He's also dealing with a woman who comes out of nowhere, if you will. She's just there to listen. We don't really know anything. Does this also kind of remind us that sometimes people out there who are on the fringe, they come in contact, they have their needs, and their needs are met, and how Jesus can do that as well. So from a preacher's angle, that's always a rich source to delve into, is Jesus encountering people, or people encountering Jesus. And interesting, again, Jesus does not know who this is until he begins to question. So, people seeking him, and in both cases, and how important that is also for us today.
This reading is one of those that on the 13th week of year B, every third year, the preacher has the privilege of working with this through the Markan perspective. Let's look at some of the Markan details. So, Robert, we're looking at the very beginning of this. You've got this, they call him ruler of the synagogue. Now, we've seen Jesus in some real contentious stuff already, early in the gospel, with these hostile scribes, at least the way Mark has them. We've seen him sort of like disparaged and in some sort of contention. What about a ruler of the synagogue? What is that, and where does he fit into the scheme of things?
Well, I mean, the initial response is we're not completely sure. He was clearly, he may have been the president. Most, I think less likely, but some sort of patron or leader of some kind in the synagogue. I think it's also important to underscore that even though Mark does have some of these hostile descriptions of the scribes and especially the Pharisees, in the gospel, it's important that even within the gospel you see that there's a range, right? That Second Temple Judaism is not being presented even by Mark as a complete monolith, although he will stereotype a little bit at times, so that there's different responses to Jesus. Jesus, of course, himself, his followers are Jewish. So it's an internal dynamic in the period that's going on, and so Jairus clearly represents, I think, somebody who is at least not antagonistic. Clearly, Jesus is sort of known as a holy person healer, and what parent wouldn't avail themselves of whatever they could to get their child better. And he's doing that.
Father Mike, how significant do you think this fell at his feet? We saw last time, just because you've got people at their feet, it's not exactly saying bow down and worship, even though the other text last time actually said that, but you're trying to you got to weigh these. Is this a throwaway line, or is this Mark sort of letting us know there's a real disposition of kneeling?
Well, certainly not a throwaway line. I think it really is. It's still a sense of submission. He's submitting to someone. I think it's significant that he is the ruler of the synagogue, so that had to be brought in. He's an important person. This important person now somehow is acknowledging the greatness of Jesus. How he sees that we really don't know. But by coming to his feet and that whole sense of submission, he finds Jesus somebody greater than himself. So again, that Markan attempt to, for us, and certainly in his time, and people that are reading his immediate work, are again seeing that even the leaders of the synagogue would acknowledge that Jesus was a very important person, greater than themselves. So I think that's real important. And then to come and to ask Jesus to do the significant thing, to cure his daughter. So he does not have the power to do that. He knows that the ruler of the synagogue. So he knows that he has no place else to go. But what he's heard and seen, and now he comes down and says, please do this. And in a sense, it's like, I know you can do this. That's why I'm here.
Robert, linguistically, how important is some of this vocabulary? It's rather powerful, I think. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. How significant is the imposition of hands back in the day, and the idea of that, so that she may be well and live? What are we dealing with that invitation?
Well, it is very rich. The laying on of hands was done. I mean, it was not uncommon among miracle workers in general, not just Jewish miracle workers, but pagan and other kinds of miracle workers. But in Mark, it's especially resonant, right? Because he wants him to lay his hands on him. So again, kind of like Father Mike was saying, he's acknowledging Jesus's potential, his power, and then so that she might be made well. The made well actually is the same verb that then often gets translated in the salvation words, so that she might be saved, right? Saved from death, healed, and then life, right? Again, there's not a lot of connections to John and Mark, but just the idea of sort of abundant life, I think, is not foreign to Mark.
We have to take our little break right now, believe it or not, but we'll be back in 1 minute to continue and to finish our commentary on Chapter 5 of the Gospel of Mark. Stay tuned. Hello again. We're into the second part of our second part of the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5. I wonder if Robert could have us to get a little bit of an idea about this woman. She comes in the middle of the story, but she is, in a sense, the center of the story, and she's a very plucky lady. Robert, tell us a little more.
Well, it's following on what Father Mike said earlier about the marginal characters, and also what I said last episode about the characters that you expect to get Jesus don't. Again, in this one, the disciples, it's almost this. What are you talking about, Jesus? Are you crazy? There's a crowd all around you, and you're asking who touched you. They clearly don't have any clue of the dynamic that's going on. The woman is showing initiative. And what I find especially interesting about this story is that the woman is very much like Jesus, because Jesus knows that power, Jesus knows his body, right? He knows that power has gone out of his body, and the woman knows her body, right? She knows that she has been healed in her body, it says. And so in a very interesting way, the woman is almost like Jesus in a very strong sense, and then it is actually her faith and action that actually performs the miracle, so that the woman has miraculous power-making power as well. And it's not just a sort of boon that Jesus is granting. Because you have faith, here, I'll give you the gift of the healing. It's actually in the struggle. This woman had to be courageous to get through the crowd to Jesus. She had to be courageous when she was caught, called out, and so it's I think a very powerful story for the hearers, because it really encourages in the listener that they should be like the woman, which is to be like Jesus.
Now, one reason you might not like to be like the woman is that you'd be ceremonially impure your whole life. And I think that's one thing worth putting on the table that we won't forget or dismiss. Not only is she needing a healing, but she's a public scourge. She is someone who has been unable to do so many things in public because of her infirmity. Where do we want to deal with that and appreciate how Jesus is so able to deal with things that are on people's list of suffering that is making them publicly inappropriate?
Well, again, I think this is another time where Jesus, if you will, deals with the status quo. Because if she has been unable to do this meant the healing for her changes her whole life, if you will. And not only does it cure her physically, but it enables her to go back into her spiritual life, if you will, to worship and to go to the synagogue and to do all of those things in a clear conscience. Jesus does this with lepers. He does this with others as well. And because of those restrictions that were put on people with such illnesses or such medical conditions, it shows she is renewed. She is given life, if you will, again, because in so many ways she was dead. So many ways she was fettered, using earlier from doing the things that gave her freedom and that gave her life. And all of a sudden, Jesus' interaction with her enables her to be free from all that. She can be normal again. And being normal was probably something she always wanted. And I think it goes deeper that the woman actually represents for people who always find themselves, through life's accidents, if you will, who cannot be normal. And certainly we can bring that implication to the forefront of today. But he offers her that's a whole new sense of freedom. And I feel also that when he feels the power go out of that, it's a force for freedom that I think the power of Jesus has for her and for the others he will encounter, and also for those, again, watching, for those wondering, who is he? Why does he do this? Who are you? Why are you here?
One thing that is, I'm noticing it in English, and I wonder if Robert will say if it's that way in Greek. 5:23 says, so that she may be made well and live, is what Jairus says. Mm-hmm. And then the woman says, if I touch even his garments, I shall be made well. I'm wondering if they're using that same verb. In English they are, which shows, again, as we're trying to show, Mark is an artist in showing at both forms of life, young and old, that Jesus is able to make it well, to bring it back from death or from defilement. Is the verb the same, Robert?
It is. It is. And it's the common word for healing, so that the word that we most often think of as salvation actually has its root in being saved by God is something like what it's like going to the doctor and having the doctor heal you, is the way the metaphor kind of works. I mean, we still have this in salves, the salve that you put on your skin or whatever has the salve root to it. I want to say I'm actually of a split mind on the uncleanness of this woman. There's a very erudite scholar by the name of Shia Cohen who knows a lot about this period, and he's pretty much persuasively, in my opinion, proved that menstruating women and women with flow of blood were actually not shunned in this period much. And Mark certainly doesn't highlight that in the story. So I'm not quite I mean, clearly her life is transformed and would include this. I'm not even sure we know she's Jewish. She may be a Gentile, although Mark often comments on that, so it's harder to be certain of that. What Mark does comment on is the fact that she spent all of her money. And so that I think that's important too, that the disease or whatever it is has sort of impacted her life. She had some money, but it's all gone, and they didn't make her better. They made her worse, or she is worse. And so the material transformation is also part of the healing, physical and material.
Staying on the idea of the parallel text, which we haven't really spent an awful lot of time yet, because we've decided to really go in the Mark and door, stay with Mark. But on this passage, Robert, you might like to help us remember how Luke decides he's going to stick up for the doctors and he's going to pull them off like they're not so bad. It doesn't mention the doctors messed up with her. But also, there's other maybe subtle ways that in the parallel text, Mark stands out differently. You had said that, I think, during the break.
Well, the point I made a few minutes ago about the woman doing the miracle or her faith is part of the struggle of coming from the margin that Father Mike mentioned. Matthew leaves out almost all of this story except for the bare bones of it, and then he changes it so that it really is kind of Jesus granting the miracle in the Matthean version, because it only happens, the actual stopping of the flow of blood happens after she's talked with Jesus. Whereas in Mark, it's immediate in her action when she touches him. And so Matthew really has kind of made a different lesson from the story.
Father Mike, if you want to help us get back to the final part of our chapter here, when it wraps up by that line 535, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house someone who said, "Your daughter is dead." You want to wrap up with us and help us appreciate how the healing of the daughter is also a very beautiful way to conclude the chapter, and also shows Jesus' ability, having just done one thing, to somehow have done something without even having to be there.
Well, again, when they come to him, they come to him with the bad news. And he's saying, well, why are you so worried? Maybe it's not all that bad. It needs, I haven't done my thing yet, if you will. And so she's sleeping, whatever it is. And so again, there's that sense of doubt among those who are close to him, and he just walks in, if you will, and he sees the wailing, he sees all the commotion, he walks into the midst of it, if you will, a midst of a noisy whole thing, and as he walks right into it, he comes and does his thing, if you will. He comes and takes her hand, again, that sense of touch, and of course then commands that she be healed, and she is healed. Again, he confronts the doubts. He confronts the doubters. He confronts those closest to him. And he goes again and, if you will, just walks into a situation and heals her. And I think that's something very important for us. And I think for Mark it was, again, he can come right into the situation, take control, and do what he felt he needed to do.
Another thing about vocabulary, Robert, I want to see if you can help us out here. And immediately the girl got up, which is arose, which is same idea of rising from the dead. And the whole idea is, I found this, Mark 1, 8, 9, 9, 10, 14, 16, same verb, talking about Jesus, third day will rise, will be raised up. How significant is it catching these images of even Peter's mother-in-law being raised? How much is Mark giving us little reminders of what's the main story here? Jesus is rising. Or is this too much?
I would say no. I mean, I think especially first with Peter's mother-in-law too, but also the woman with the hemorrhage being sort of almost quasi-divine herself, and now the girl is and then you have the anonymous woman who's anointing Jesus in chapter 14. So you have all of these women who are sort of divine characters or prophetic characters who are sort of announcing and embodying the resurrection. So I think it's certainly present. There's an interesting thing Mark does too that I've sort of been working on in my own research about the way characters interact, so that as this story is reintroduced, while Jesus was still speaking, he gets interrupted, right? And so with a very harsh, your daughter is dead, right? I mean, it's just awful, right? There's no whatever. So it's...
Speaking of being interrupted, they're telling us right now we've got like 30 seconds. So what I want to do is let you know that we are enjoying this. We hope you are bringing your Bibles. We hope you're using this in your scripture study. If you need discs, call the diocese. Go to YouTube, look it up under the Gospel of Mark. We are hoping to have them all posted. We want you to know that this idea of connecting the two stories is brilliant, and each one sheds the light, because it's the daughter who Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has saved you," and it is the daughter who is saved, who is the young girl. Till next week, God bless.